Ted, do you want to get us any rules? Any
No, you guys have
housekeeping
all been
rules?
here, enough of these already. You're relatively civilized, so let's just proceed.
Okay, and I have pardons from Tom Powers, who is flying across the country for his nephew's funeral at this moment, and Brian, who is in a 2-day suicide watch workshop for his medical society. So anyhow, welcome to all of you discussants. And we're on the next leg of our voyage, actually. Hopefully, we'll be discussing some of the critical points. We've listened, of course, starting with Mamphela and then Carlos, and even before that, David, have given us large metaphysical overviews. And then Julia started us in actual transformational examples. And I think her transformational example of how the king was so important, but how there were other levers and factors for the nation to become transformed was very important. And then Ted whirled us around the world breathlessly as we listened to scores of transformations for communities. And now we're going to listen to Mamphela leading off, and then John's full discussion of his LEAP schools of science and math. And I think we need to think, what happened in these transformations? How did it happen? What was the analysis that began? And then what happened when the people began pushing levers and changing things and looking at assumptions and taking new actions? I think the action part is very important for us to think about in terms of our what we have. But I think we can encourage at the end robust discussions from all of us. And I think the discussions through our own lenses, we have a rose-colored lens, a blue lens, a green lens. I think this is going to be very important in us making an overview of what we find to be the meta principles of transformations. So I think, first of all, I'd like very much to introduce Mamphela. It gives me great pleasure to do this. She's such a shooting star. And this woman, of all of us, of everybody who's ever been in the Club of Rome, in fact, has just made a magnificent transformation of a whole nation. I think somebody is not muted. Ted, could you mute everybody? And that may mean I have to, thank you. So first of all, Mamphela, of course, grew up in far north South Africa. And then she was admitted into the medical school in Natal, which was the only medical school for Black doctors that didn't need a specific government okay to go ahead. And in 1971, she got her Bachelor of Surgery. But something very important happened there that I hope she talks about a little, which was the South African Black Students Organization and the Black consciousness understanding, realization, analysis that came out of this with Steve Biko and the other Black students in the late 1960s and the 1970s, after which she was in charge of community health in the Eastern Cape. And then she was detained on very spurious circumstances and sent.
Anitra, you have gone mute. I'm going to mute other people right now automatically to maybe open up your channel. Okay, I do. At the moment, I do not have contact with Anitra. No contact. So perhaps we can move to Mamphela. I'm sure she will come back on as soon as she can. But Mamphela, if you would like to take over, please do.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is for me a very important moment in our history as a human community, a human race, a single human race. And today I want to use a metaphor that's topmost in the minds of all of us: vaccination. I was vaccinated against racism, sexism, and all the isms through a process of consciousness that we as young Black students at the University of Natal had to dig ourselves out of a hole we had been put in by the apartheid system that called us non-white. So the first act of consciousness for us was to rename ourselves Black and to proclaim pride in who we were and to go back to the rich heritage that most of us who were in that context had grown up on, which is the Ubuntu philosophy. We were taught over and over again, whatever you were doing, whether it's coughing without putting your hand on your mouth or not greeting people, that is not the way of Ubuntu. A person, a human being, does not do that. So the vaccination against racism and sexism landed on very rich soil of Ubuntu. But just being conscious is not enough. And here I want to bring in the founder of the Club of Rome, Aurelio Piche, who towards the end of his life was a disappointed man, because despite the signs of the limits to growth, there was no real significant shift in the mindsets of human beings and policymakers across the globe. So he then championed no limits to learning, which John obviously is an example of, but then thought that that learning has to be accompanied by something else. And this is expressed in the last book he co-authored called Before It Is Too Late, which he co-authored with a Japanese guru, Akeda. And I just want to remind you of the kernel of his championing at the end of his time. And this is what he said: the development of the Amala consciousness level is comparable to working and fertilizing agricultural soil. The inner revolution only bears fruit when it is directed outward in practical acts in actual society. The person who has undergone a human revolution on the deepest level of his consciousness knows how to relate to nature and with other human beings. And since the human revolution is the key to positive action leading to the adoption of a new course and the revival of human fortunes. So I think this is an apt way of my introducing you to John Gilmour, who's this person who has undergone a human revolution on the deepest levels of his consciousness and overcome the white privilege, male chauvinism of his upbringing to be this agricultural worker who's tilling the soil of so many young people. This afternoon, we launched the Ubuntu Mathematics Institute. What a joy. What a joy for a person like me who had to do the cramming. What he's doing is tilling. He's tilling the soil. John?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that beautiful introduction as usual and for the wisdom that just flows from you. I just want to take a moment to welcome Tom Caston. I know that he hasn't been introduced to the group. Tom is a great friend of mine and a supporter of the work. He's based in Chicago, Hinsdale, and has a particular interest in this conversation. So Tom, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to just start with a provocative thought, is that we're in the process here of talking about transformative cultural innovation and changing from one civilization to another, from one value system to another. And I think that part of the journey of the voyageurs has been to really make peace with what we don't know, and then to live into the questions. And I have found the journey with this group really a beautiful journey of living into the questions more deeply and practicing asking the right questions of ourselves, not for the answers, but for the understanding of the question, and paying attention to our relationships. I think we know that that's the only way we're going to get a regenerative culture to emerge. If we find and live new ways of relating to ourselves, to the ecosystems, and Mamphela's been talking about that consciousness elevation that actually makes this possible, to community and to life as a whole. So at the core of our work as voyageurs on the journey seeking to create regenerative cultures is an invitation to live the questions together. This comes from a subchapter of designing regenerative cultures. And I've always found a very useful tool in the Johari window. The Johari window is a psychological tool created by Joseph Lift and Harry Ingham years ago. And it's a simple tool which we use a lot for bringing insight and understanding. In the top quadrant is the known, left-hand top quadrant is the known self.
Bradford, I can't talk right now. I'm in the middle of a conference call. I'll call you back later.
So we have in the top left-hand quadrant the things we know about ourselves and that others know about us. And that's the easy part of our lives. That's called our comfort zone. And then we have the things we know about ourselves that others do not know, which is the hidden self. And we have the blind self. There are things people know about me that I don't know about myself. Strangely, that's very true. And that's the blind self. And then, of course, there's this mass of the unknown, what things people don't know about me and things I don't know about myself. Now, when we apply that to what do we know as voyageurs on a journey, as a Club of Rome trying to really look for the levers of change in regeneration, we know what we do know. We know about the limits to growth. We know about there's no limit to learning. But there are also things that some of us know that others don't know. And in that sharing, we may get closer to what we don't know. And the unknown knowns we can also get to by sharing with each other. So I think we're on the right journey of just sharing and asking the right questions. So
John,
what are the right...
what are the questions that in your view we need to live together to find answers in terms of moving forward toward a new regenerative civilization?
Great, welcome back, Anitra. I'm so glad you're here. I was wondering how I was going to bridge the conversation, but thank you. The real global challenge for me is that everything is broken into pieces. And we talk about poverty and hunger and well-being and quality education as though they are separate issues. And the real global challenge is for us to find ways of changing behavior. Ultimately, we have to change the behavior of ourselves and global citizens in the context of all the challenges, because there is no planet B. So maybe the question that takes us closer to the real question is, how do we get global citizens to embrace the interconnectedness of all aspects of sustainable living? Mamphela shared with us the concept of Ubuntu, in which the interconnectedness and interdependence is central to all behavior. So the real question, I think, as an educator, who's also working in the field of human regeneration and community regeneration, is what are the positive triggers for changing the patterns of entitled, extractive, consumptive human behavior? And this should be the focus of our collective attention. And if we take the diagram that Anitra shared with us in the last meeting, and I've adapted this to the education context, and you look at what we're trying to do, we're trying to move people from, in the communities that we're working in, from a survival mindset to a generative mindset. We're trying to move people away from the passive, entrenched, conventional ways of thinking and behaving to creative, collaborative solution thinking that will enable innovation and disruption. Now, to do this, we have to get into the living systems thinking, where we pay attention to quality and quantity, not just to what's quantifiable, where we think about what doing the right thing is, as opposed to doing things right, and where we look at systems view of life as opposed to the mechanistic and technological silos and fragments. We have to think in patterns and principles. And if you look at that line across the bottom, going from conventional surviving passively, there's a large part of the world just living like that. And somehow it takes crisis like COVID to cause a reactive, impulsive reaction, and sometimes a more strategic one. We're trying to move this forward beyond the restorative to the participative. And in terms of education, I'll share with you the model that we've adopted. And in the center that we started today with the Ubuntu Institute for Maths, we are recognizing that maths is a literacy. And if it's not linked to the competencies of critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration, and not linked to the development of character, it's a hollow and empty set of words, much like language that prattles on, sounds like. And obviously we're striving for insight and metacognition, which are other words for higher levels of consciousness. All of these things interconnect. We can't have social and economic elements to well-being without the cultural and environmental elements integrated. And unfortunately, the way education has worked is to detach these elements and teach them as though they are parallel, when in reality, they're completely interconnected, just as the world's cultural and natural heritage are completely interconnected.
Now I've completely lost where we are. You said I was in the wrong place.
No, you're in the right place, completely the right place.
So how do you go about ensuring that regenerative learning is experiential?
Okay, we're a bit ahead of that. Let me just share with you where we are and what we do. So we, as you know, are in the southern part of Africa, in South Africa, and our schools are spread across 6 sites, and each school has about 300 to 400 people in it. And we have chosen intentionally to work in communities that are in the lowest economic quintile. And our goal is to reverse the patterns of lost generations of children. And the communities we work in, these are snapshots from those communities. So just get a sense of the complexity of the work of regeneration in spaces such as these, and understand that the only place to begin is with the individual gaining a strong sense of self. So we've worked to create transformative methodologies that involve what Mamphela has taught us, the healing circles of consciousness. On a daily basis, every child is in such a circle. The experiential learning as reflected in the picture on the right with the science laboratory in this situation of the classroom. And of course, the integration of digital technology using cell phones and tied to the calculator. And that's enough. That's enough for children to be empowered and to actually develop what they need. We do this in the context of a cultural coherence. We have rejected the notion that colonial value systems apply to culture, and we're enabling our children to reclaim their interconnectedness, the music, the rhythm, the poetry, never as separate disciplines, always as integrated disciplines. And as Mamphela and as Anitra said in the introduction, we built on the regenerative Black consciousness movement of the 60s and the 70s. And here's a very beautiful photograph of Mamphela and Steve Biko in that time period. And this methodology changed the trajectory of South African history. Few people sitting around a table, becoming fully conscious and sharing with others and asking the right questions and living the right questions and planting in the soil and looking after the children changed the trajectory of history. We have in South Africa and the world. And we've taken that learning and also included some of the regenerative elements of addiction intervention strategies that we've explored and modern neuroscience growth mindset discoveries. And so in this process, we live in the interface between the inner and the outer world. And I refer here to Julia's beautiful presentation, where she took us right to that interface and reminded us of how delicate that interface is and how important it is to honor it and to go deep. And in the process, we always separate the rational and the emotional minds, but we have to integrate them to ensure that regenerative patterns of action are made possible. Mamphela wrote a book in her years as a university scholar called Steering by the Stars. This book had a profound impact on me because she took children from the communities which we serve in Cape Town and just took them out of that urban jungle that I showed you and put them into beautiful natural space. And that in itself began to change the consciousness. And Mamphela documents the impact of that work in the book Steering by the Stars. But even in the 60s, Dr. John Henry Clark, a scholar in America, reminded us then that every form of true education is developing, I don't like the word train anymore, but developing the student in self-reliance. And isn't that what we want? Isn't this a case of moving the world towards a greater sense of interdependent self-reliance? The assumptions we challenge then are the colonial Eurocentric assumptions that everything happens in the head and you just keep teaching the head. The 21st century reality, compounded by COVID-19 and by all the other national and international movements for equity, show us we need global citizens who are intuitive, compassionate, motivated, and adaptive. Now, if we just continue as we are in Africa, we will never catch up. And the incremental approach to education improvement is a lie. It is actually a regression rather than an advance. So we build with simple values. The values of Ubuntu are reflected in the code of conduct of LEAP, and that code of conduct is understood by every child and every teacher. And that's the only guide to living that we have. We hold each other to account in that code of conduct. It is both aspirational and it creates accountability. And it doesn't have a negative word in it. It doesn't say don't, do not. It doesn't rail against the outcomes. It tells you that there's something intrinsic here that is worth embracing. And surely again, what we're working for as Voyagers is the behavior that must change should be intrinsically motivated and aspirational rather than driven by survival-based fear or fear of getting caught or fear of consequences. And the ultimate is that all of this value approach triggers metacognition, and then we can embrace the interconnectedness and interdependence of Ubuntu. But we tie this strongly to the maths and science because maths and science were used as weapons against Black people throughout colonial rule and apartheid rule. And Black students were not allowed to study maths and science unless they found a subversive or transgressive way of doing that, as Mamphela did. And she was an outlier, a significant outlier, but a very lonely outlier. That still is the pattern in our education. We have to shift the role of teachers to becoming facilitators of learning and not the transmitters of information. And the work has to happen in circles where everyone's voice is heard. where we can learn to be mindful. This is an African tradition, the letsema, or the meeting around the fire, if you'd like to think of it that way, to discuss and debate, cross-generational, learning to be mindful, recognizing, owning, and expressing our emotions. As a white man living privileged education in this country, I was not taught to do that. I was taught not to recognize, never to own, and very rarely to express. And that is an inhibitor of my own learning, which I am unlearning. Translating positive insight into action, where we become fearless, where we embrace peer support, we recognize the strength of others, and we develop our own growth mindset.
Give us some idea about the reality in South Africa in 2021. What has really happened education-wise since 1994, when apartheid was shoved out the door? And tell us about the public schools, which are the large part of education in South Africa, especially to those economically challenged.
Sure. Well, it's not a pretty picture, but I'm going to give you 3 graphs that will show you some of the challenges. So currently, the gap between the red line, which is Black African, and we're using the language of apartheid because we have no choice but to keep measuring what was used as discriminatory tactic. The orangey yellow is so-called colored, mixed race people. The green is Asian and Indian, and the blue is white. So if you look at the percentage of children progressing to grade 7 in the left-hand graphic, to grade 9 in the central graphic, and to grade 12 in the right-hand graphic, you will see the unthinkable has continued to happen. And this has got worse. The downturn that you see in the Black African and colored groupings, where the arrow is, has got worse with COVID because of increased dropouts. Now, if you take the proportion of matric graduates who attain a bachelor's degree, which is a post-school qualification, taking them into the high skills level, we're not talking about hard-edged numbers, we're talking about proportions. We'll see that white proportions have continued to increase, undulate and then increase. And in the Indian and Asian group, it's more or less been a plateau. But in Black and colored groupings, the chances of getting a degree, if you're a Black child in 2021, are significantly reduced. And they were pretty low in 1994. And bear in mind that 80% of the population fits into the Black line, about 10% fits into the yellow line, 3% in the green, and 7% in the blue. So what does that look like in terms of employment? Well, if you again go to 1994, these graphs show per age group the skills, the people skilled, working in skilled jobs. So the percentage of total employment within each population group working in a skilled job, a job requiring training. And you can see the anomaly of 1994, the extreme range. But unfortunately, what has happened in these figures only go as far as 2017. You can see that there's been a regression. In the Black African age group 25 to 34, there are 14% lower proportional number of people employed in the skills sector. So the truth is, Anitra, that the Eurocentric methods that have been brought here and entrenched here have failed us. And our hypothesis is that we've got to shift from the cognitive domain to the intuitive and spiritual domain of consciousness. And that we need to put consciousness education at the center, because the current reality that 104 million African children are not at school. And that's gone up probably now to 108 in the last 6 months. Millions are dropping out of school, and we're creating unemployable masses, which clearly represent a threat at many levels, and also create an ongoing gender disparity as women have to carry the responsibility for so much, including childbirth at very young ages. So when you take the attainments of LEAP measured against the national figures, we know that we're very small, but we're working in the communities which are the most difficult. And so our pass rates, taking all factors into account, are more than double the national public schools, which include the Indian, the white, and the colored statistics. Our access to university, 72% of the children we teach from these communities have access to university. Measure that against a maximum of 5% of children coming from townships who gain access to university. This is a phenomenal success that we understand needs to be shared, because it's not so much to do with the cognitive approach, it's entirely to do with the consciousness approach.
After the 17 years of this transformative success that you've had with LEAP, measured against the control, which of course is the public school, which is a very sad educational reality, can you share some of the regenerative products, the transformational products that have come from your LEAP work?
Certainly. I think we now know what we know, and we know that we've learned to do agile technology integration, particularly in the last 2 years, and to close the digital divide using cell phones. The issue is not the level of the technology, the issue is access to the technology, and cell phones provide access as long as there's data and a relatively reasonable smartphone. We know how to reduce dropouts to almost zero. Our story of dropouts is remarkable. We know how to increase and retain maths and science students, and it's very little to do with the maths and science teachers by themselves, it's the whole. We know how to increase university access and to get the qualifications for children to go to and through. And we've worked to create self-regulating, empowered young people who then become positive role models committed to community regeneration. And the issue of community regeneration is critical. We know that we spent a lot of time with Ted last time talking about community as the basic entity. So the long-term products are that our children go to and through tertiary study, and it's no longer just for the outlier, 72% as opposed to 1 out of 72 in Mamphela's case. We know that we can produce productive citizens, and they build careers, and they begin immediately to contribute to community and national economic growth. We had a couple of our past students in the meeting that we had today, and their voices were just so crystal clear and so powerful. We know how that the graduates from LEAP don't want to dump their communities. They want to actually help with the regeneration of their own communities. This is growing a social movement of young change makers, and we hope that there will be a tipping point to that will allow us to, in fact, have greater impact. The young people are young leaders, and of course, particularly 66% of our graduates are girls. The significant change in the trajectory and breaking the cycle of poverty for girls is very dramatic. Now, how do we do this? Consciousness raising involves getting into the food pots, getting into the soil. It doesn't involve thinking cleverly. When Mamphela and Steve Biko set up a space in the Eastern Cape, they had a food garden, and they had a clinic, and they took care of the children, and they had learning spaces. Here you're looking at a learning space in the community of Langa, which serves as a place for children to come and learn in the evenings. It serves as a place for old pensioners to run their sewing clubs, and it's also a food kitchen. And you can see the 2 young children, LEAP children, helping the younger ones eat. But we think that the real solution comes when young people, like this young woman here under the 48, and these 2 beautiful young women here with me, and this young man, Wazi Pakadi, who are all graduates of university now. In fact, all 4 of them are double graduates. They've already got their postgraduate qualifications. And they've chosen to serve in different places. Yameka works in the provincial government. Lungiswa works in LEAP as a community liaison officer, and Lwazi is standing for office in the next election. We've used our schools to teach our children what giving is, and to create the schools as hubs and as food distribution hubs. So, and not just food, but obviously the hygiene products that are necessary, particularly the feminine hygiene product. We're not proud of the fact that our schools are hubs. We're proud of the fact that our young people are serving the community in these hubs created from schools. Now, to go from sustainability to regeneration is not just about words, it's a change in mindset. And we believe that it's got to be values at the center of value. We always talk about the value of a good education, but we very rarely talk about the values of a good education. At LEAP, we talk about the values before we measure the value. And these values can be broken into worldview, ecological, economic, and social, and they speak for themselves. Those are the LEAP Institute and LEAP School values that we are embracing.
Obviously, this is very needed by the 104, or as you say, perhaps 108 million students in sub-Saharan Africa that UNESCO has defined are out of the school system. What are your proposals to take this innovative and transformative methodology to other parts of Africa, and what are your plans?
So we have been working very hard to establish the LEAP African Institute, Sub-Saharan African Institute, which we now will call the Institute for Educational Regenerativity. Now, there are 4 components to this work. There's the components which are colored in orange, which are all instructional revolutionary practices, including the Ubuntu Maths Institute, which we launched today. But they include living laboratories, which I'll talk about in a moment. On the right, at the top in the yellow, are the consciousness elements. We have a subject called life orientation, and we teaching teachers to facilitate learning in the life orientation circles of healing. We have to reclaim the stolen legacy, and we want to establish multiple Ubuntu academies. In the blue, we have the rights issues, the advocacy issues. We teach our children, and we want to work in the Institute in Africa how to do that. And of course, then there's the throughput to career pathways and to actual experience, through experiential learning, to contribute to agriculture and science. We intend to work very closely with international agencies and African partners, including the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And we're in constant communication with them. Thank goodness we have Mamphela leveraging for us, as well as Anitra playing a very important role in those conversations, and I'm very grateful to them. We're working to reframe the focus of education spending so that we can challenge it and make sure that our partnerships will trigger better international sustainability, but also impactful education investment funding, and not a waste of money that doesn't have regenerative outcomes, but simply creates dependencies. So these partnerships we're working on, we are designing and building African solutions for African challenges with international partners. And I love this, these quotes from Kane Blythe and Paul Jepson from the book Rewilding, which my daughter, who's studying marine science, shared with me. It's time to allow the interactions rather than the human interventions to steer the future trajectory of natural systems. Well, the LEAP School is a place of human interaction. It is, of course, a place of intervention, but the intervention is only to create the interaction. And that's true of all regenerative work. And I think the Rewilding's narrative for this group offers a real alternative to the relentless communication of facts that foretell of an ecological and climate emergency and how we're all going to be consumed. So we encourage everyone that we meet to leap, to unlock intrinsic motivation. These are the LEAP learnings, if you like. We need to unlock intrinsic motivation to ensure sustainable regenerative commitment in action, to focus on the values underpinning the value, and to ask the questions that need to be asked about that, to develop an invitation to all people to join the global community in support of the recoverable earth, not of the unrecoverable earth, and to replace reactive interventions with sustained transformative interactions. We need to create high expectations of people who join this movement and not have them work with low marks of fear. Because if we don't unlearn and learn new behavior that is system focused, we have no planet B.
It's very heartwarming for me to see that there's going to be interaction between the students, the Black students, and the ecosystems, because of course I've spent my life regenerating ecosystems, and it has been my observation in 5 continents that learning frequently, if there is not a school involved, is a series of youth following a well-practiced fisherman or house builder or somebody behind them. So how do you go about ensuring regenerative learning is experiential rather than a cognitive forebrain colonial Western Hemisphere kind of learning with books and classrooms. What is your experiential theme for the school?
Well, that's a lovely question. This is one of the reasons I'm glad Tom Casson is with us, because it's a question he's asked of us. And you'll see that word Ubuntu that says, I am because we are, has to be the values under the Leap Living laboratories that we are now creating. Every school in Africa should have a living laboratory, a living learning laboratory, outdoors. It should be planting, it should be regenerating, like the plants you see on the bottom right-hand corner are called speckboom. And speckboom is a very, very remarkable plant that grows from a cutting. And so it's very easy to propagate. And it actually sequesters carbon at an unprecedented rate. And it grows almost anywhere in our country. So we are trying to develop learner-teacher resource kits that will enable them to take any space, doesn't have to be refined space, any space, and create action-oriented, ethics-led, transgressive, values-based education that is experiential. So what could that look like? Well, here's one example of a recent addition to our center in Langa, where we've managed to put hanging gardens in place and to teach the community how vertical gardens can be used quite easily and inexpensively. And of course, the shade cloth simply provides the laboratory for us to accelerate the growth and to measure and to engage in experimentation there too. But we feel that in these confined urban spaces, we have to teach the community to reclaim what it knows and reclaim its relationship with the earth. And so here you see two young people, not graduates of LEAP, but community people who've been trained and developed to run the garden in a very, very confined space, including that one I've just shown you. And look at the symbols on the left-hand side. You've got the slogan which says, keep Langa strong. This is a LEAP center, by the way, an urban center. And then you have the scientific symbols which say this, all of these things are integrated. Because when we talk about self-liberation, it really means being empowered to claim the autonomy when it's possible and when it's needed. And food security and a regular income obviously allow for a reimagined community future. We can't detach those from any other reality. And so we take our children and we get them to plant speckworm in large spaces as well as in the small spaces and grow their own and hopefully generate trees that can be traded for fees. And so we've begun a campaign which will move towards trees for fees. And of course, the regenerative ecosystem, you see the beautiful African elephant loving the speckworm. It's a delicacy for the elephant, and they love this particular plant. Now, to get to scale, you can't just do this with children. We have to reset the learning process, and we have to develop teachers. And that's where the LEAP Institute is going to focus on enabling teachers to see themselves as co-creators and co-designers of teaching and learning with the students, and open up the doors to teaching that is transgressive and experiential and collaborative and interdisciplinary and innovative. The rewilding narrative of Paul Jepson and Ken Blythe is really helpful to me because it says, let's rewrite or write a new narrative for a recoverable earth. Let's take where we are in the sense of despair and move towards that consciousness awakening. Let's rethink, reassess, move to action, not get stuck in the awakening, and celebrate the awakening. And in the process, change the attitudes, change the mindsets and the expectations, and we can move towards that wellness recovery that we've talked about, where we work with meaning, we have purpose, and we value health. So Anitra, that's my story for you. I'm really looking forward to some questions and answers, and that Mamphela can get deep involved in that, and maybe a discussion will follow that too. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And it's a magnificent piece of work, and it's certainly a transformation at an extremely important interface. And we have some people in the room that I think would like to say a few things about this. But first, Mamphela, who has been the patron of the LEAP schools for some period of time. I think her reflections, particularly on this day when you launched the Ubuntu Math Institute in cooperation with LEAP. Could we hear from Mamphela about her reflections on this?
Thank you very much, Anitra, and thanks, John, and thanks to all the colleagues. I think my reaction to what John has presented is simply to be grateful that we have people like John in a country like mine, which has missed so many opportunities. John has been working with successive governments to try and get them to accept this transformative learning approach. But as Aurelio Piche, our founder, reminds us, unless people have gone through the human revolution, traveling inward in order to change their mindsets, it's very difficult to get the change. The good news is just how this COVID experience and the state capture instability in the country has gotten many more people to be receptive. And of course, 17 years of John's experimentation with the LEAP school and the spectacular results that he's getting out of the most broken communities is not going unnoticed. And so my excitement today is that this Ubuntu Mathematics Institute that John has launched is opening the doors to the LEAP school approach to mathematics and science, which accounts for their high success rate, to every child, every teacher. I mean, they're going to have a teacher workshop this weekend for those who want. So it is a typical Ubuntu approach, abundance. So the more you give, the more you get. That's the beauty. And of course, across our borders, we are in conversations with the World Bank, who originally wanted us to start in Eswatini, but of course, they are caught up in the problems of people overstaying their welcome and extending their reach. And now Lesotho is opening to the idea of the LEAP school model. And the beautiful thing is that we are not going to go there and teach Basotho how to do what. No, it is about sharing, helping them to ask those deep questions. And John, in his incredible way, has built a team, including a man who has a PhD in education, who's been working all over. He's a Zimbabwean, but he has worked in Kenya and in Rwanda, and now he's here. So the Global Teachers Institute is now going to accompany the LEAP schools as they go into these spaces. So I'm very proud, and I'm hoping that we as the Club of Rome can see this as a model of what our founder in championing no limits to learning and in championing the importance of the human revolution to shift mindsets is possible. If we can find ways, as Julia is doing in her own country, all of us, there's no one size fits all. But we believe that this model has a lot to offer for people to then take and adapt to their various situations. Thank you.
And it's a Southern solution for not just a Southern problem, because this problem is seen in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Oceania, etc. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mamphela. I have 3 people who I would like to give us their reflections first. One is David Corton, who began this whole dialogue because he said, we can't eat money. What if we shifted from the present GDP financially oriented values to a well-being set of values? The second is the former head of the board and president leader of the Club of Rome, Professor Ernst van Weizsäcker. And the third is Dr. Julia Kim, who has graced us with the first of these examples of real transformation. Would one of you like to begin? Perhaps beauty before age, and Julia could begin. Ladies first, or something of that nature. Julia?
Thank you, Anitra. Wow, thank you so much, John and Mamphela, for sharing those experiences. They really touched my heart. And having spent 10 years or so in rural parts of South Africa, those images really come to my mind very clearly. Some of the reflections that came to my mind are a little bit around the consciousness shift, which I think you've both mentioned as being really central. And a phrase you used, John, about things you've had to unlearn. And I'm curious about to hear a little bit more about the process of how that happens and how students and teachers receive that, because it is sensitive and powerful, and it's hard to kind of break down into a menu or a series of steps. My experience has been it depends very much on the inner condition of the person who's leading that kind of process. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And then a kind of systems reflection, which is if we back out to the larger well-being economy lens again, I think we know that in so many countries, teachers are some of the really poorly paid professions. And in many countries like South Africa, people went into teaching and nursing because they were the only jobs they could get. So it wasn't necessarily that intrinsic motivation for themselves. So I'm wondering how we can turn that around in an economy where teachers should be some of the highest paid people in our society because they have the most important job. In Bhutan, they recently made teachers and healthcare workers the highest paid civil servants in the country. That's what the latest prime minister did, recognizing that important role. So I want to put that in the back of our minds as a well-being economy issue. And my final point is just a reflection on something Anitra said. I think not just a lesson from the South for the countries that she mentioned, but if we look at what has happened in countries like the United States and how people have responded to crises like COVID, and what that says about the quality of education of common people and their ability to respond to the times that we're in. I think this kind of education is as relevant in the so-called developed countries as in the so-called developing countries. So thank you for those presentations, John.
Thank you.
John, do you want to respond to that, or do you want to respond to all 3 once David and Ernst have said?
If they all ask as many questions as Julia, I'll be in serious trouble.
Yeah, all right. Answer then.
Let me try and go quickly to it. I think just to the last one, and maybe an integrated answer is that I think what I've observed in the United States, as an example, and in the West, is everything in education gets so tightly compartmentalized, and then we run around a lot trying to look for interdepartmental kind of projects that we hold the departments. What Africa has as a beauty is there's no difference between poetry, drama, and music. There's just no difference. You don't say, is this poetry or is this music? It's performance, it's joy, it's expression. And that's true in community life too, and the integration of language and mathematics. For example, we were hearing today about how the Basotho language has a complete pattern of mathematics in its language, as opposed to English, which of course has everything but a pattern because it's essentially a conglomeration of multiple languages. So I think there's a lot to learn about integrating rather than another piece. And what I can't stand hearing in the West is we're now doing the social emotional piece as though it's a piece. It's not a piece, it's our lives. We are social emotional beings. So how dare we call it a piece of work or a piece of learning? And when we do that, we simply perpetuate this idea of surviving in social emotional language and trying to thrive in cognitive language. The issue of teachers, I am a believer, and I've proven it, that if you get young people around you and you show them the beauty and the joy of breakthroughs in learning, they will never want to do anything but teach. And of course, it would be nice if we got better paid. I'm not arguing, and I would be an advocate for that. I'm with you on that. But if that's the reason for why people will be drawn to teaching, we better review why we encourage people to become teachers. We're going to get the wrong people to become teachers if we simply scale it up. We need to be getting children, like those 2 children you saw, feeding those babies. They want to be teachers now. And we've got such a cohort of young people from LEAP. 12% of our graduates have become teachers. 3 of our schools are led by LEAP students who became teachers and 10 years later became principals. I think it's about role modeling. It's about freeing children. We never say, would you like to be a teacher? Our question is, would you like to be a future leader? And we call teachers future leaders, young training. So the aspiration is built into the invitation. And then we say, would you like to be a social activist? Because the world needs social activists, it needs integrators, it needs facilitators. And they used to be called teachers, but now they can do all of that stuff and have fun and live lives of joy. And so we've started the Global Teachers Institute, where we are recruiting children from the communities, the underserved communities, and they make the most remarkable teachers and accelerate very quickly into leadership. So I'm very optimistic about that. The Global Teachers Institute is a byproduct of the work of LEAP. Yeah, and I think that covers, did I miss one?
No,
No, okay.
thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
Ernst I want to introduce Ernst to our little discussion group here because we all know that he was co-president of the Club of Rome for 7, perhaps 8 years, I can't count. And before that was both a member of parliament in the German Republic, as well as a professor of environment and social change, and has written multiple books, and now is very active in his various projects and NGOs. Would you honor us with your reflections on this?
Oh, sure, of course. I was extremely privileged at the wonderful meeting in Cape Town that Mamphela had arranged to sit next to John Gilmour on the bus. And so I was listening to him and was very much impressed and think, this is an absolutely great thing. I may not have mentioned at the time that when a predecessor as president of the Club of Rome, Prince El Hassan bin Talal from Jordan, was president, and the secretariat of the club was in Hamburg, Germany, they began to establish so-called Club of Rome schools, and they are flourishing. And I see a great deal of similarities between the two. And one of the experiences I had in my life is learning by teaching. Of course, everybody knows the slogan, learning by doing, of course. But learning by teaching is extremely productive. I mean, in a way, I'm learning that also from John Gilmour, that to be a teacher makes you learn, makes you understand what the problems are. But then you also need the kind of attitude which you have been describing, which is just wonderful. Let me add one other little remark. In our book for the Club of Rome, Come On, we are asking for a new enlightenment. The old enlightenment had major mistakes, including, of course, colonialism, including, of course, utilitarian thinking only, or materialistic thinking, individualistic thinking, and all that. This has to be overcome. And in that context, when I'm speaking in Germany about the New Enlightenment, one of the first words I'm using is Ubuntu, which is a different way of looking at reality and of social cohesion and all that, which did not exist in the old European Enlightenment. So we have to learn from other cultures, including in particular the African culture. So I am very, very grateful having the privilege of sharing, of listening to you and sharing a tiny bit of work from ourselves.
Thank you, Ernst, very much. David?
Yeah. John, I just thought that was extraordinary. And what you've laid out for education is totally revolutionary. And yet it takes it from the abstraction and the abstracting students from life to the integration with life in a way that, I find my thinking has been drifting toward, but never heard it put into practical application the way you're doing. I just loved it. So, but what I want to raise are two things kind of mentioned in passing in your presentation that I did not understand why they were there. One was what sounded like an endorsement of economic growth, which I think most of us consider to be the front line of most everything that's going wrong in our economy. So I was wondering, did I misunderstand? Were you endorsing it or condemning it? But the other thing that I find most curious was, while I certainly understand the importance of mathematics, why do you name the institute the Ubuntu Institute for Math rather than the Ubuntu Institute for Living? Math is essential to living in a modern society, but it's a kind of an abstraction. It sets us apart from the immersion in the living reality that most everything you're teaching is all about.
John?
Well, I think there's a big question there. The big question is the economic question. How do you operate in one paradigm to achieve another set of possibilities? And when you are poor and hungry, the only thing you're thinking about is some income to ameliorate that. So when I use the term economic growth, I'm talking from a family point of view. A house can be built for the first time and there's sustainable income. If the actual work that is done by our beautiful young people were to be valued and rewarded, we would be very, very wealthy. So I long for the day where the wellness economy manages to reward what is truly beautiful. But in the short term, my organization is short funded all the time. And I'm always going with the cap in hand, and I'm not sustainable. The organization is not sustainable. But the society I live in is less sustainable than my organization. And so we have to work in that paradigm to leverage it. And when the people who give me money want to know what that will do to economic growth, I can pretty much guarantee them it's going to do a lot more than what they're trying to do by false stimulation of an economy will do. But I'm hoping rather subversively that this Club of Rome will turn it all on its head and we won't have that economy, and then my children will thrive. So
I just urge you to describe it in the terms you're using now and just leave out the economic growth so we don't.
yeah, no, and it's a very good caution because it's a throwaway. It's often a throwaway line to a corporate that I'm trying to, tell they need me and they need this work when they're not sure about that. So,
Mamphela, would you like to reply to those two questions of David's?
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the institutes using the frame math rather than Ubuntu for a living.
Well, the reality is that let's talk about the broader issue of economic growth. David knows that I'm not one to believe in the economic growth as my previous institution, the World Bank, believes in. But we're talking here about emerging from where we are, which is a world which is preoccupied with economic growth, through this kind of intervention. What John is doing is in each community, the schools, the LEAP schools become the center of community that generate livelihoods for the communities through the services the school offers in the form of learning and teaching, but also the services the community offers in terms of working with the teachers and the school leaders to provide for a healthy environment in which children can eat and wash and have all those bare necessities. So yes, the critique of economic growth has to be there, and I think John should be a lot more nuanced in using that. But the fact of the matter is, every community needs to engage in activities that build sustainable livelihoods. That's what this is about. Now, mathematics is lifted up simply to enable young people to break that glass ceiling, because it has become like a glass ceiling. As I said at the beginning, I only had 2 years to learn 12 years of mathematics because the then apartheid system said Black people should not learn mathematics because they must be hewers of wood and drawers of water. And because of that, cumulatively, the teachers who are there in our schools in the poorest areas don't themselves understand the language of mathematics. And mathematics has been presented as a Western concept. And the beauty of the launch of this Ubuntu Mathematics Institute today is that it included archival history that shows that Pythagoras was taught by Africans. All of this wonderful Greek things are African. He stole Africa's intellectual property. There's nothing wrong with him having learned. You could have just gone there and say, hey, I came back from Egypt. This is what I've learned. No. He stole it. And then when the colonials were wanting to make us be afraid of mathematics, they said, we don't have the brains to think in 3 dimensions. And this is not in the 50s. No, I'm talking about when I was at the University of Cape Town. Funders, corporate funders. My predecessor would go and ask for bursaries to support Black engineering students. And corporates would say, Black people can think in 3 dimensions. How did they build pyramids? Excuse me. How? But this is now the struggle we have to be waging here in Africa to help young Africans and old Africans to reclaim their intellectual property and their ability to do exactly as they please, because God doesn't say, I give Europeans, he just created us equal. And so the wonder of John's work is how it, at the same time as it graduates A's in math and science, it graduates young people who are inoculated forever against white racism, male chauvinism, anything. They can walk tall wherever they go. And so I speak here as one of those vaccinated African women. Thank you.
Okay, so it's sort of a gesture to the old system.
I think it's. I do think it's. I do think it's more than that, David. I think it is that, but I think it's more than that. In that, one of the most. Julia asked the question about my choice of the word unlearning. It's not my word. I learned that word from Paulo Freire, the revolutionary educationalist from South America, who wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that book shattered me. That book disturbed me. That book awakened me to have to look at myself differently, because it said, you're one of those white guys who denies that you are like the other white guys, okay? You always want to tell them you're not like the other ones. You know, I'm different from the other ones. When you are like those, so can you just get real a bit and then be that person so we know who we're talking about? And Paulo Freire said, you are by association the oppressor. So I come into my schools knowing that I represent the oppressor, because those children have internalized their oppression. And I have internalized the legacy of being the oppressor. And until we can look at each other, Mamphela and I have had this experience together of having to, generally Mamphela waking me up from my blind spots, but sometimes the other way too. And in those exchanges, the realization of what I've internalized, and I think that's to go back to what I don't even know about myself. So if we've internalized inferiority as Africans, the biggest tool that the colonial powers used was mathematics to discriminate. Now we're saying, quite rightly with your gesture, that's not going to be. I don't mind if somebody masters maths and becomes a psychologist. I love it. I don't mind if they master maths and become an artist. I love it, because they'll never have to say the things I hear millions of people around me saying. I can't do maths. I'm not good at it. I'm useless. And I had that experience with an art teacher who told me you should possibly give up drawing at the age of 11 or 12. And that has affected me with that same kind of internalized fear of showing anyone anything I've ever drawn. So I live the projection that was put onto me. So I think the Maths Institute says, in our Maths Institute, we will sing, we will dance, we will play music, we will read poetry, which is what we did today. Because maths is an integrating function, not a separating function. So it's a subversive strategy, David.
Beautiful.
We have several questions, including Marilyn and David and Ted. So I'd like to call them once more. Beauty before age. Marilyn?
Thank you so much, John, and thank you so much, Mamphela. And I don't know quite how to formulate this, but this is really from Mamphela. Mamphela, when you were going through the darkest and the hardest times, what were the forces of transformation that we could apply to other places? When I look, for example, at Afghanistan, where I'm very involved, and some other areas in Africa, I think, what are the forces that lift you up so that we can create the transformation that's sustainable, so that we can create these communities of light, and that we can create enough communities of light that they grow in, they aren't the early adopters, but they become the way of being. Because I think that what John is saying and what you're saying is these need to become the way of being. So I think back to you in the hardest times, and to where things have moved, and wonder how to, and look at how do we apply that to places that are challenged.
Mamphela?
You know, I think the best entry point into those challenge spaces is education. And I'm looking at myself during that time. What saved me and the few of us who ended up at medical school was the fact that we came from families that believed in education as the key to the future. The Mandelas, who came from desperately poor environments. But once you are there, and it so happens that I was one of those fortunate people to be there in the late 60s when there was a global movement of anti-establishment, the Vietnam, anti-Vietnam War, blah, blah, blah. We grabbed the spark of light from the Black Power movement to respond to the humiliation that we were suffering under a so-called or what they called multiracial student organization called National Union of South African Students, where if you have a conference, and this is where the tipping point came, a conference at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, where Black students, having anticipated this, said to their white counterparts, please make sure that if the authorities want to separate us in terms of sleeping arrangements, we must all stay together and resist. Yes, they got there, they registered. The white students took their bags and wheeled them to the residences, and Black students were shown to a cold church. Now, Grahamstown in July is freezing cold. And imagine a church with no carpets on the floor, it's just cement, and they've just put mattresses on the floor. This was what was good enough for Black university students. And that's what got Steve Biko to say, this is it. And he went back and said to those fellow students of his, I'm not going to sleep in that church. You are not going to sleep in the residences. We're going to sit here the whole night and sort this out. They didn't sort it out. And he walked out of that. And that then forced us as Black students to realize that unless we find a pathway out of this mess of color-coded privilege, we're not going to get them. We can't rely on white students to fight our struggles. And so this is how we then got to educate ourselves from snippets from the Black Power movement, from Paula Freire, from Martin Luther King, from all of that, until we realize that the biggest barrier to freedom is your mindset that accepts the labels. At that time, we used to say, we the non-white students. Imagine in Africa, you are non-white? Are you nuts? It's like me going to Ernst's place and say, you are non-South African, you Germans. They'll shoot me out of the place. But somehow, generations of South Africans had accepted this non-being. So going back to your question, and of course, once we made that mindset shift, that connection, we were free.
Mhm.
We lost the fear of arrest, of death, or any, and of course, many of my friends died. But that didn't stop those of us who are alive from continuing. We all agreed that we are going to fight until we are free. Now, let's take the Afghanistan issue. It's more complex. It's been there for eons. But what is clear when you watch what's going on over the last few months is that no foreign power is going to free the Afghani people. They have to find it within themselves to be free. And that is very difficult in a very highly patriarchal, toxic environment, which is why I think those who are working with Afghans have to find creative, transgressive ways of using education as the key. I know that the Taliban are closing schools, particularly for girls. So we have to find ways of creating safe spaces for Afghani people to find out who they are, define themselves in ways that one day, as it happened, in our case, it was 1976, high school students, it wasn't Mandela who freed us, high school students stood up and said, no more Bantu education. Afghanistan will have to have some impetus that gets the Afghan people to say enough. Because right now, the Taliban is making all these gains supported by communities who think that they are the freedom fighters. So it's complex. I don't have the answer, but I can only say that once you are mentally free, nobody can imprison you. Once you're mentally, emotionally, and spiritually free, you are free forever. And that's my lived experience. It's a high risk one, but we were prepared to die fighting rather than die as slaves.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful statement, Mamphela. We're going to have an intervention by a supporter of LEAP, Tom Caston, who's from the Middle West, very close to where I grew up in the Chicago suburban area. And he's very interested in regeneration, which of course what we're all interested in. Tom, you want to take the floor with your reflections?
Tom, you are muted.
You need to be muted. Can you unmute him, Ted?
Yeah.
Tom,
okay.
can you unmute yourself?
There, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
You
Yes.
are able to
Thank
unmute
you.
yourselves.
Thank you.
I am so impressed with what John has done. It's, if you wrote a book, it's unbelievable that 90% of the population gets 5% into college, and he changes that around to match the very top schools. It's unbelievable. And I am honored to have gotten to know John Gilmour. I have a couple observations. In the process of working, we have facilitated a teacher exchange where the LEAP teachers come here to our community. It's not all white, but it's all rich. And one of the top schools in the state regularly. And his teachers have come here for 2 to 3 weeks in the classroom. Our teachers in the schools for a week, and then a week with the Global Institute. And sadly, COVID has interrupted that. But one of the things we've learned is that at the core of what LEAP accomplishes is that life experience, sitting around and understanding. And we got a little word for it, social emotional training, but we're so busy cramming stuff down people's throats and trying to get them into the very top school that we don't realize that their emotional problems are just as blocking as the ones that John faces. And so that piece of learning, our assistant superintendent for education in the high school and the superintendent of our middle schools have both come back with that insight, and we thank you. My other comment from all my work with agriculture and other things is that at the root of everything the Club of Rome has been at, and I've incidentally been following it since 74, is that Darwin got it wrong. Not consciously, but he didn't have the tools or the microscopes to understand. He created a whole thing of survival of the fittest, and that got woke into the economic fabric and everything else. And what we now know, especially in the last 25, 30 years, is that everything is an ecosystem. Our bodies, we have more microbes in our body than cells. In agriculture, it all depends on this incredible complex symbiotic system. Conventional agriculture has done its best to destroy the symbiotic system. So I think at the core of the problems we face, we need to reframe the statement of Darwin. Evolution favors the survival of the fittest ecosystem, not individual. And once you go to that, the layers start to peel back. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to have several people who've been asking questions. First of all, David Pollock, and then Ted, and then Herbie. David?
I think he's disappeared for the moment. He maybe will be back.
All right, so you're next then, Ted.
Okay. Well, I am delighted with this because we desperately require success stories. And in fact, that's why I've very much enjoyed John's and Julia's and the various ones where we're trying to identify what really works where. So, I think you heard me talk about a lot of different successes around the world, all of which have been a challenge to get started. And the thing that really, I think I'd love to hear your comments on is how on earth do you get communities to decide to buy in, to try and change their life, to enhance their well-being? Because you seem to have a wonderful vehicle, but how do you get it started?
John and Mamphela, whoever wants to go first. John?
Well, for me, the answer is very personal. It's develop relationships with people before you try and do anything in the community. And develop the relationship not on the condition that you're going to do something if the relationship is positive. Learn. So I do not have a postgraduate degree, but I have a PhD in the dust on my shoes for the number of times I've walked in and out of the homes and the houses and the communities of the people in the communities that I had no understanding of. And I can remember one grandmother of a boy that I was coaching sport, and he said, "Come and meet my grandmother." And bear in mind that I was 30 and he wanted a father, that I was his sports coach. And I was a very reluctant father. I didn't want to be a father, I wanted to be a sports coach. And when he took me home and his mother looked at me and she said, "Oh, young man, you've got so much to learn." And she was bold enough as a 70-year-old Black woman who's meeting me for the first time to treat me like her child and say, "You know, you've got a lot to learn." And she was right. And once I started to say, let me learn what I'm able to learn from my teachers, who are my students, that was the unlearning begun. And of course, I'm a very stubborn learner, so you have to be very patient and determined to get through my resistance. And these young people are, because they long for intimacy. And people living in community are longing to belong, but they don't want to be cheated or treated as though they are dependents. And so the liberation comes when the trust builds and you ask the community, what do you think this community needs? The young people I was teaching in another school, which was previously white, told me, I should start a school in their community. And that was how the idea was born.
Thank you.
Mamphela, did you want to answer that?
Just one point. When I visited the Leap School in Diepsloot, I asked one young student who was the guide for our little group, how did you get to come to Leap? She said, Mama, you stand at the street corner, you can identify Leap students. I said, how do you know them? They are respectful. They are always talking in measured terms, very helpful, very considerate, and they are always disciplined. And I looked at them and said, I want to be like them. Thank you.
John Richardson?
Yeah. So as I said in my comment, I don't think we fully realize the degree to which most of our educational systems, like our economy, is built on an ethic of scarcity rather than abundance. And I want to just give one brief example. As some of you know, I've lived with students for about 15 years. And I came to a new environment, and students came to ask me for help building their computer models, which is what I teach. And so we had a wonderful discussion, and I coached them, and they were very happy, and we worked together to create a great model. The instructor sought me out, and he said, John, you helped my students. And I thought, yeah, I did. He said, I don't ever want you to do that again, not ever. And I said, what? And I said, why not? He said, it's not fair to the other students because we have only so many grades of A. I mean, he didn't say quite this way, that we can give. But our educational system, our tenure system, and our economy are grounded in an ethic of scarcity rather than abundance. And I could give more. I've lived with students for years, and I could give more examples. And that's, by the way our system of empowering faculty members works as well. There are ways to put a stop to that, but it ain't easy.
So I believe that you've hit the nail on the head, that the scarcity mindset is what teachers internalize. And then they get to things and they prioritize things like curriculum coverage, huge priority in our country. I have covered the curriculum, which means they've stood in front of a class and spoken about what's in the book. And they've spoken about everything that's in the book. And therefore education has happened.
And if the students can repeat that back, they've learned.
Even better if they can memorize it, because then it's 100% measurement. So I think but the scarcity goes beyond that. The scarcity is tied to what Julia was asking around, am I valued as a teacher? And my views is, do you value yourself as a teacher? Let's start there. And if you need me to value as a teacher, then you are trapped in the dishonesty of your own narrative. And so I think that's why everything comes down, and Julia did ask this question way back. How do we do it? We do it through difficult conversations, facilitated on a daily basis, every day for 5 years. And the conversations are in a circle, and every child sits in that circle, and the circle starts with some mindfulness practices, and then say, okay, who wants to check in? What are we dealing with today? Who's angry? What do you want to bring into this room? It's not a curriculum, it's a process which brings emotional safety. You activate the authentic voice. And if I could just extend one more, I know I'm answering too long, but the boys and the men in our community are silent and do not speak. And in South Africa, silence in men generally means violence in men. How do we change that behavior? You change the behavior by making speaking a peer-pressured outcome. And it's a positive peer pressure. You can't be in this group unless you speak, my friend. It's not coming from the teacher, it's coming from his peer. And the power of the peer group is what I learned in addiction intervention. Addiction addicts do not listen to counselors, they listen to addicts. And the impact of addicts on addicts is more direct than the impact of any adult in that context, any older person in that context. Now, if you extrapolate that down to being addicted to survival, you can see why that addiction therapy approach of circles of emotional safety is critical.
Mamphela?
Can I just add to that in terms of the system approach? I'm a co-founder of an organization called Reimagine South Africa. Basically, we need to reimagine what it is we wanted to be in 1994 because we have lost our way. But one of the most remarkable successes of this Ubuntu circles, these healing circles, is that, I don't know how many of you remember, there was a massacre that happened 9 years ago in a mine where the police opened fire on mine workers who wanted pay increase, okay? That place is called Marikana. It's a platinum mine. It was under Lonmin. It has now been bought by Sibanye Stillwaters, which is a company which is now the biggest mining company in South Africa, bigger than Anglo, because Anglo has decided to externalize its wealth outside South Africa. But what the new company did was to invite Reimagine SA to come and have these circles of healing. It's incredible how the CEO, who is your normal South African white man, totally engages without the idea of hierarchy in this circle of healing. And people feel safe enough to open up about how they've never sat in a circle or in proximity to lower level workers, to women, to Black people, and so on. And so we've been involved with them since December. It's an incredible journey. It's a long journey. It's a painful journey, but it works. To knit people together. And once people have found comfort in the circle, which doesn't mean that everything goes right, but that it connects, it does what Ubuntu is intended to do, to take us back, as I made a reference in the chat to a book called Building Innovation on Nature's Intelligence by Lynn Gorison. And she concludes that book by encouraging us to become indigenous again because of her lessons from people in traditional leaders in Australia, in Latin America, everywhere. And what they taught her is exactly what Ubuntu is. It's about recognizing that we as human beings have to re-nature ourselves so that we can be able to go back to interconnectedness and interdependence, not in a scarcity environment, but by knowing that by doing that, there is more. The more you give, the more the ecosystem is able to give everybody. And now this being done by a mining company, which is extractive by its nature, is very interesting because now they have to rethink everything about from extractive to regenerative is a long journey, but it is happening. And I think with the education system, John is getting more and more provinces to say, hey, John, can you come and just try out your method in this district or that district? And of course, now that the World Bank is saying, John, please come with your model to Lesotho, I think slowly but surely, we might be able to rekindle our indigeneity, which will remind us at a very deep level about what really makes us is our being connected to others and being dependent on others in a reciprocal set of relationships.
Thank you, Mamphela. That was very profound. Irby?
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for
Yes.
your really wonderful presentation. And so my academic background is cultural ecology and social anthropology. And my question is this: there's this amazing richness in traditions in African lifestyles, whether it's from hunter-gatherer societies, whether it is from agroforestry societies who I visited on the slopes of Kilimanjaro, whether it's cattle herding and generally herding societies right across South Africa and East Africa. All of these traditions are basically Ubuntu-based circular systems, regenerative systems. They could not exist unless people on a daily basis give back to nature and assure nature to regenerate itself. And so we could look at many other examples in different parts of the world, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Hindu society, or indeed in traditional Chinese society, where basically the question of give and take between the community and the natural system around it is of the essence. Unless that is practiced, there will be no survival ultimately on the long term. Even in Europe, we have a fantastic tradition too. There's a wonderful book by a German geographer called von Thünen, who describes the way traditional villages in Europe always had to relate around to the community, to the land around them, agricultural land around them, on a give and take basis. So my question is whether, to what extent these types of traditional practices are actually incorporated in your teaching processes. Are you teaching people the traditions from which their societies spring from originally?
John?
The straight answer is yes, we are teaching that. And of course, we're teaching within a historical context, or, you know, what history is and how it's been written by the victors, and so is a distortion of what's real. So there's a rectification or reclamation of the true history that needs to be taught. What is more difficult is to teach within a cultural context where the urban impact has eroded the cultural context to such an extent that some of the traditions have become drinking rituals at the expense of being anything else. So there's a very delicate line to pick there. And I find that in the life orientation space, the children teach each other. And once you've unlocked the honest voice, the authentic voice of a child, that accountability comes back in. So I taught history. And one of the things I had to do right from the start of my period as a history teacher in a LEAP school was to say, who's teaching you? What do you see? And so how much of a source can this man be of the truth for you? And how are you going to navigate me as a teacher with my particular view? And they understood that. And I put a picture of Steve Biko up on the top of the cupboard. And I said, so you look up there when I'm speaking and you ask, what would he ask him? And then, so in everything, there is a difficult conversation. And in teaching culture and unlocking understanding of culture and asking the children to go back to their grandparents and talk about the culture and tradition, the oral tradition kicks in. And it's still intact. It's still intact in Africa, in South Africa, but it's half a generation away from cracking.
Thank you.
Mamphela, would you like to answer that? Because Mamphela, of course, in 91 got a PhD in anthropology, as well as her MD that she got in the 70s.
Yes, I think John has really put it well. The point is, Hebby, all of us are indigenous in one form or the other, just that we don't say in Europe there are tribes. They are there, and they all have their different customs. But there is an assumption that there is something that knits together what is called European. What I'm hoping these interventions that John is leading is that African people will realize that, yes, our languages may be different, our individual customs different. At the essence, at the core, is this Ubuntu, which is common across Africa. It's got different names for it, but it's the same thing. And it's not only common across Africa, it's common across all indigenous peoples, as I indicated to you. And this book, Natural Intelligence, I really recommend it to you. It's by Lynn Gorison. It brings us back home that there is much we can learn from indigenous knowledge and culture, but also that the shared scientific knowledge we have taught with respect to the culture and the dignity of people wherever they are, it simply makes for a richness and such great success. And the kids, once they see that their music, their customs, their proverbs, their poetry is all part and parcel of the knowledge system, then you really are cooking with gas, as the Americans say.
Can I just throw in one more point, which I think might be relevant to this discussion? Some years ago, I did a TV series for the BBC, where we did a 7-hour TV series on the history of human impact. And one of the things we looked at in that TV series was the impact of Rome on North Africa 2,000 years ago, which was basically a landscape pretty similar to what you still see in West Africa, in East Africa and South Africa. Acacia forests full of lions, tigers, zebras, rhinos, the lot, basically, all the monkey varieties. Well, when you look at North Africa today, it's been basically a cleaned out landscape, but Sub-Saharan Africa still has that amazing richness of fauna that North Africa had 2,000 years ago. And I think to look at the difference between those two parts of Africa, I think it's absolutely extraordinary to see, and that should be taught very, very loudly and clearly in schools in Southern Africa, because here you still have, even though a lot of fauna is now under pressure, particularly from outside for ivory and all the rest of it, nevertheless, you still have a relatively intact, vast landscape that was maintained partly because of the Ubuntu philosophy, I believe, of people sort of not interfering to that extent that they wiped out whole landscapes of a variety of life in ways that has taken place 2,000 years ago in North Africa. It's now taking place in places like the Amazon and Malaysia, Indonesia, rainforests, and so on and so forth. Anyway, just an observation.
Anita, I saw Julia's hand up some time ago.
Who? Ted?
Julia's hand.
Julia.
Julia
Okay.
had her hand up, and so does John.
Yes. All right. Julia.
At least on the screen.
Ted was next, but Julia, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Thanks, Anitra. Yeah, I was just thinking, this has been such an extraordinary conversation, and it seems so linked to the well-being economy conversation we're having, that it starts with the shift in mindset and the consciousness shift. And in some ways, as the cynic in me goes, how long will this take? And at the same time, I know there are no shortcuts. We have to start now with all the generations that are showing up. So my question, John and Mamphela, I was really struck by your first slide, or your early slide, John, that had the 4 squares. And you were talking about our ability to be with what we don't know. And when you went to the third square, which is what I don't know about myself, but others know about me. You know, the scarcity mentality part of me always thinks, oh, those are the shadows and all the things I need to get rid of, the terrible side of me that's hiding in the closet. But of course, for educators and students, also, there are often real jewels and blessings about yourself that you don't see that others do see. And that's one of the joys of being a teacher. And I'm curious about that third and fourth box, the one that we don't know and others don't know, which from the G&H potential side, gross national happiness would say that the point of the education is for us to awaken our highest human potential. And by definition, there is no ceiling to that. And by definition, it's not going to fit into the bell curve that John Richardson was talking about. So from your experience, are there any curiosities or inklings for you about what might we find if we move in this direction?
I'm so glad that's a question that I sleep well and badly on every night, because I think that's the critical question. And what do we do to just create that shift into the unknown of what I should know or could know and don't know, and nobody is yet knows it them enough to be able to share that with me.
But that's why we're here doing this conversation.
Exactly. So that's the purpose of this conversation.
That's the purpose.
Yeah, the summation of all ignorance equals wisdom. And we're rather hoping to pull all of this together in some fashion that we can make a difference.
I think we're going to get two things. We're going to get wisdom and we're going to get process.
Yeah.
And I think that where we're focused in the LEAP context is on process.
Mm-hmm.
So the process says, we don't know what we don't know, nor do you know what you don't know. But when we come together and we share what we do know, we have a better chance of stumbling into that unknown. And I want to just ask Mamphela to share with you the very basic principle which she shared with me years ago around a letsema and what a letsema is. And I'll give you a very quick snapshot from my point of view. There's a problem in the community. We don't know what to do. So will you come with what you have and sit in a circle and let's solve the problem? One comes with a spade, one comes with a bucket. I'm oversimplifying. And one comes with a shovel. And we sit together and say, now, what is the problem? Do we know how to solve this problem? No, we don't. What do we have? What have we done before? And what should we try? Let's try something that may solve this problem. Now, that's a process rather than a product. So I think that's, for me, critical here. We've got to come up with better processes and be comfortable with not knowing where the process is taking us. Because when we are uncomfortable with not knowing where the process is taking us, we will never get into that fourth quadrant, ever. Mamphela, I'm sorry, I stole the story.
I mean, that's exactly the process we are using in this Marikana healing and transformation program. Is this not knowing what you don't know about yourself and other people perhaps knowing what you don't know about yourself, or none of us knowing what we don't know about ourselves. In this context of a circle, the idea of a circle is that it's a social level. So no boss, no kind of lower level person. We are all on the same level. The ear is the most important tool of the circle. You bring these, two of these and one of this. Listening. But also the eye-to-eye contact. Eyeball contact is a great, and I'm not a psychologist, but it's amazing how much you can read into somebody's eyes, their happiness or how they get offended by what you say, or discomfort or joy or whatever. Now, people who are schooled in the healing traditions use these conversational circles very effectively to unearth the unknown, which at the beginning may be unknown even to them, but then they, because they've done this several times, they can, through engaging with you, unearth the unknown. But also, we know in both psychology and other healing professions, you have to yourself go and get into conversations with someone wiser than you to help you as the healer to be aware of your own wounds. So a healer who's most effective is the healer who is conscious of their wounds and possible unknown wounds. And so the Letsema process is a process. It's a process that brings healing both to the individual, to the family, to the community, and if you extrapolate, in the case of Sibanye, after 9 years of fighting about who's responsible for that massacre, they are now talking about what do we do now? And what do we have to deal with what we need to do to make the transition from an extractive institutional culture to a more transformative, inclusive one, and also to look forward to the mines have to be closed at some stage. How are we going to have sustainable livelihoods for everybody and restore the land that has been disturbed by mining?
That comes next time. That's my presentation.
Anitra,
And
you
also-
have to come next now. We've been defining the problems and some of the solutions.
Yes.
But we need all the rest of them.
Well, the point is, I always deal with the unknown because
There
these
you go.
things can't talk, can't tell you what their problem is.
Mhm.
And nobody knew much about it when we started, but you keep looking and looking. And then my thing is to think like a marine plant, and then I sing to them and they give me their secrets. They reflect back their secret. I do, and I tell my best planters, sing to them. And the only ones who so forth have sang to them were some of the Native American, some Mexicans and some Native American Indians, and they would go down their little planting line and they would sing to the plants, and the plants would be able to regenerate beautifully because they sang to them. But that's just an aside. Okay. John Richardson, did you have another reflection? Because Ted is going to.
No,
All right, Ted?
Would you just
You're
let
up.
me wrap everything up about now? Are there any other people who want to speak? Because this is really just logistics, which is that we are going to be finishing the recording in a minute or two. You will get a copy, I hope, as long as the technology is working, and it appears to be. And we are, Anitra, do we know when we wish to schedule the next one, or are we still working on that?
Well, the problem is all these people are taking time. Like Carlos said, he was still on the end of his vacation. He couldn't join us because the shore of Spain didn't have enough internet.
I'd be at
And-
the shore of Spain too if they'd let me. Nice place. Far better than sitting here watching the traffic go
I was
by.
thinking either the week before Labor Day or the week after
Okay.
Labor Day. So, and it'll be on a
Yeah.
Thursday.
So we'll get
Yes.
back to you with specifics. We will, is it okay if we keep trying for Thursdays? Anybody object specifically? Okay. It's the best
John,
we
do you
can
have
right now.
any last words before Ted wraps?
No, just very grateful. Thank you for this opportunity. And I feel like this Voyagers group is really beginning to ask the right questions. We're asking the right questions of ourselves and beginning to live the questions together. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
I think John's very right in that. We actually are asking questions and we're trying to listen to each other. So with luck, each one of these gets richer as we go, and we hope that's true. So once again, then I will thank you, and Anitra always gets the last word anyway, don't you? So thank you very much for coming. And Anitra, do you want to say one last thing before I shut off the recording?
I wanted to tell everybody that Ernst said he wishes to thank John Mamphela and me for an extremely rich discussion, but his grandchildren had cooked dinner and it's late there. I suppose it's 9 p.m. So they said, they demanded that he come away to dinner, but he said it was a very rich discussion. I want to thank John and Mamphela, particularly. They've had a hard day. They launched the Ubuntu Math Institute. Both of them were into that space earlier. And we're extremely grateful for the fabulous work they're doing in the midst of a depressing COVID and declining educational system in South Africa. So they're great heroes, just like Marilyn is with her Afghan women's education. So thank you all for coming. Go ahead, Ted.
Okay, well, I'll just thank you all very much. We can't do without any of you. We value your thoughts, of course, and we wish to keep getting them from you. And we also are looking for some suggestions to gradually add 1 or 2 more people to help us with this challenge. So that said, I'd like to thank you all for coming. And it's been valuable for us, I think, all the way along. And I hope to see you all there next time. And I'm going to shut off the recording now. Have a very great week or 2, and we'll get in touch with you again very shortly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.